Okay, so there's two dudes that are in a writing group together. They call themselves the Inklings. One of them we know as J.R.R. Tolkien, and the other one we know of as C.S. Lewis. They're both working on some weird fantasy stories together. Tolkien's working on one, and he's struggling a lot because he's trying to invent this entire world, and it's taking up a lot of his time. It's a lot of effort. And C.S. Lewis, who's in his writing group, strongly encourages him over multiple years to try to get this project done. It takes him 15 years, but he does do it. We know that project as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It was during their time as friends that Tolkien actually talked a lot about religion and God with C.S. Lewis, and along with the stuff that C.S. Lewis is looking into himself, actually helps to convert him to Christianity. Though we know that Tolkien was a Catholic, and so we know that this was a point of contention later on. But the whole time that Tolkien is working on this work and C.S. Lewis is encouraging him to do it, he's also working on his own fantasy work of fairy tales that would become the Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis really liked the limited scope in vocabulary and the sort of whimsical nature of fairy tales, and so he wanted to create a world that was very lighthearted and include a lot of elements from all of his fantastical inspirations. And of course, that's the series that, like I said, we get to know as the Chronicles of Narnia. Funnily enough, Tolkien was not a fan of Narnia, even though Lewis really loved the Lord of the Rings world. And the main reason for that was Tolkien really hated the fact that Lewis's books were way too allegorical. He kind of just threw them out completely because of that. Tolkien and his Catholic faith believed that in creating stories, mankind is sub-creating as a method of worshiping a creative God. When he looked at what Lewis was doing and what he considered too allegorical, he thought that it was kind of uninspired, a little bit preachy and hacky, and probably because of his Catholic faith, didn't really like the sort of musing about theological things. He kind of thought that should be left to the experts, aka the church. But oddly enough, and this is something that I did not figure out until this year, C.S. Lewis never considered his work allegorical. Most of the time, you hear as a Christian of any sort that the Chronicles of Narnia is an allegory of the Christian life and the gospel story. And I think especially when you are looking at the original book that C.S. Lewis wrote, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's impossible to not see allusions and parallels to the story of Jesus. But based on C.S. Lewis's own definition of what allegory was, which is a substitution of a character in a story or an abstract idea into a story, into a way that we can understand a little better, this is not really the way that Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis wanted to approach the story from the position of, suppose there were a magical world, what might religion be like in that world? It might be similar to the way that Christianity works here on Earth. And so I think that changes maybe a little bit of the way that we should be analyzing Lewis's work, especially when it comes to matters of theology. The problem is within Christianity, you see a lot of people looking at the Chronicles of Narnia and you see them assessing the potential doctrinal implications of what he has with his characters. And you assume that that's actually what Lewis believed and was teaching exactly word for word as if it were allegory. But because of the nature that C.S. Lewis was using when he wrote these stories, that seems a little bit unfair. That being said, of course, Lewis's theological beliefs were portrayed to some degree in this book in different characters in different ways. We see that throughout the series, especially if you know some of Lewis's beliefs about the Christian faith and about his beliefs on different theological doctrines. So subconsciously or consciously, a lot of the symbolism is there. I think that Lewis also was known for saying that he did try to sneak theology and these kind of thoughts into his books, but to treat the Chronicles of Narnia as a straight theology, this is what Lewis believed and this is what he was teaching, is a little bit unfair. Also somewhat controversially to the people of his day and also to people like Tolkien and maybe even some people today, the other fantastical elements that Lewis drew from in the Chronicles of Narnia with various druidic folklore and mythological creatures, etc. These were criticized as being trying to mix paganism with Christianity, which was frowned upon at the time. Some people still have a problem with it now. But it was really, these were the elements of creativity that Lewis tried to put into his book to try to make at the time, modern fairy tale. So I hope I got that out in the correct way. I hope that made sense. Let's jump into my experience with The Chronicles of Narnia. Okay, so let's talk about my first exposure to the Chronicles of Narnia. So I grew up in a very conservative Christian home, and like is very common, though not universal in that sort of home, my parents avoided anything that was magical in nature and like stories. So a lot of like wizards and witches stories. I wasn't allowed to read like Harry Potter growing up, and I knew this. So when I went to a friend's house and they had rented like the VHS BBC version adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I started watching it with them, I definitely didn't think it was something I would be allowed to watch. I actually remember calling my mom on the phone and saying like, hey, I don't think I'm supposed to be watching this, but my friend's mom was convinced you'd let me watch this. I don't know. Is this something that you would want me to watch? I kind of explained what it was, and she said, oh yeah, that's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's totally fine. Which, I don't want to dwell on it, but there is a little bit of a disconnect in some of these circles on allowing some fantasy, namely The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Chronicles of Narnia, and The Lord of the Rings, but not other types of fantasy. It's actually quite common. Nevertheless, because I had never been exposed to any sort of fantasy at all, jumping right into that movie adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe blew my little kid mind and expanded my imagination in a way and resonates with my tastes to this day. If you didn't already know, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, 4 children that have to stay with a distant relative are playing in a house, and the children accidentally stumble into a wardrobe, and instead of just sticking in a closet like you would think, they end up in the magical world of Narnia. I'm just now coming to realize that this is probably maybe one of the original inventions of what is now a subgenre of fantasy called the portal fantasy genre, which is where it takes place partially in our world or something like that, and then you go through a portal into a magical, more fantastical realm. The fairy tale nature of this story gripped me immediately, and even on my first watch as a young Christian boy, I recognized the themes and the obvious parallels between Aslan in this story and Jesus in the Bible. But if I'm being 100% honest, when I first watched that movie, that wasn't really the part that had me interested. It was the portal fantasy, fantastical elements, these characters that were working together with talking animals to fight a wicked witch and end the eternal winter. Those are the things that made me super interested. I definitely resonated with some of the spiritual parallels, but like I said, I'd never been exposed to fantasy before. And as a kid with a very active imagination, I immediately started coming up with all of these scenarios to where I would be able to get to Narnia. That next year in school, I was able to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the book. And it was one of those experiences where you're reading a book for school and you can't read ahead because you're supposed to be reading it with a group. And I couldn't take it because even though I knew the story from the movie, I just wanted to read this book as fast as possible because I found it so gripping. Honestly, at that point, I didn't even realize that it was a series of 7 books. And even though I frequented 2 different libraries at the time, and I was a pretty avid reader as a kid, I never read the rest of the Narnia books right away. And so aside from watching that movie and reading that book and maybe renting that movie from the library at least 1 or 2 more times, I took a little bit of a break from Narnia. After a few years only knowing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is the most popular book in the franchise, my mom rented, I assume she rented or checked out from the library, the first chronological book in this series in the form of an audio drama. Focus on the Family, through the Focus on the Family radio theater, which I don't even know if it still exists anymore, released dramatized audio versions. They're not completely unabridged, but they are extremely faithful to source material, the books. Like I said, dramatized versions of all 7 books in the Chronicles of Narnia. I now own them all, and I recommend them highly if you are a fan of the Narnia series, or maybe it would be a great way for you to check it out if you don't want to read the books. The audio dramas are spectacular. And it was through that audio drama that I was exposed to the first book in the series, The Magician's Nephew. And to say that that book left an impression on me would be a huge understatement. In that book, two children come across magical rings that transport them to other worlds. The first world they go to is a dying world that's falling apart, and then they escape that world, but trailing them is a wicked witch, and then they end up in the yet uncreated world of Narnia. And in The Magician's Nephew, we get to see the origins of Narnia and how Aslan creates it by singing, which is pretty cool, as well as the origin of sin and evil in Narnia and how it transgressed from our world. And we also get a little bit of a hint and a throw at how the wardrobe from the first book written in the series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, was created. And these connections between the two books, as well as the magical rings that could bring you between different worlds, and the fact that in that book there happens to be an implication that there are numerous numbers of unvisited worlds that could be accessed from one place, blew my brain. It was so cool. I thought it was the best story in the entire world, and for a long time, The Magician's Nephew was probably just my favorite book of all time. I read that book after I heard the audio drama, and I listened to it repeatedly, because The Magician's Nephew was my jam, and the wood between the worlds and the magic rings and Charn, exploring Charn would be such an enthralling experience. I loved it so much. And at that point, I tried exploring The Horse and His Boy, the third book chronologically. Technically, it takes place during the second book, because it takes place while the children in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe are kings and queens of Narnia. And I really bounced off The Horse and His Boy the first time that I read it. I eventually came around to liking that story. I don't know if I didn't connect with the characters or the fact that it mostly took place entirely in Narnia with a lot less interaction from people from our world, which kind of the original draw was the fact that we, in our real life, normal, boring, monotonous world, could go to a magical world with fawns and centaurs and lions. That was kind of the original draw. And so maybe I didn't identify with The Horse and His Boy or connect with it as much because it had a lot less to do with that. But anyway, it took me a while to get past that book because I wanted to make sure that I read them in chronological order. Eventually, I was able to get through The Horse and His Boy, and I read Prince Caspian. And the coolest thing about Prince Caspian is that you get to see the children from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, who I had originally connected with so strongly, revisit Narnia, and it's a magical time. And even though I, at this point, sit with Prince Caspian as being my least favorite book overall, because of a lot of just parade scenes, there's a lot of parading around. There's like 2 chapters in a very short children's book of just kind of parading around Narnia. But seeing the re-entering of these children into this magical world through another method, and then getting the idea that there were multiple magical ways to leave our world and go to the world of Narnia, always kept me thinking and imagining and wanting to go on these otherworldly adventures, coming up with so many different scenarios in my head, and designing worlds of my own to play imaginary with my brother and my sister, and just fighting these things. Like, this just totally expanded me. At this point, I also knew lots of other children that were reading these books at different rates, and so I got to talk to them. This was the first time I really got to talk about books in depth with other children my own age. BookTube is that release for me now, but for me then, I was able to talk about Narnia with all of my friends. We were all reading it. Everyone would talk about which of the books was their favorite. Of course, mine was The Magician's Nephew. I hadn't read further on in the series. A lot of people's favorites were The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. That was the most common book that I saw. But I hadn't read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It sounded a little bit scary to my little kid brain. And when I got to Voyage of the Dawn Treader, man, that was a crazy adventure. It is maybe the most episodic of the books because you're going from scenario to scenario without a lot of super connective tissue. It's almost an adventure for adventure's sake without a lot of other super trying plot threads. But the mysteries that the characters come across in each of those scenarios, and the fact that Lewis didn't feel, because he was doing a fairy tale type telling, he didn't feel the need to over-explain everything or have this hard, fast magic system with rules, actually helped stimulate more creativity than I think he would have done if he had tried to make, a Lord of the Rings style world. I would eventually get to Lord of the Rings and love that later. But the unboundedness of the whimsy was what really drove me forward, and that really shows probably the best, I think, in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where you get to see all of these random islands with different magical properties and different lessons for the characters to learn. And the end of that book is so serenely beautiful that even as a child, I had to admire it. My next favorite was The Silver Chair, which also has a BBC adaptation. I believe the adaptations of the BBC ones are The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and The Silver Chair. And The Silver Chair let us experience a whole other level of the world. You went to a different section of the world. You got to go underground. You got to the whole conceit of Prince Rilian and the scene where the kids find him in the chair and he's trying to convince them to let him out. It was quite scary to me at a young age, but that sort of minor bit of horror gripped me and had me thinking about a whole other aspect of types of storytelling, where you could have scary parts of the story be scary in a good way. And the urgency of the quest in The Silver Chair, specifically once they reach Underworld, is a lot different than the general whimsiness of the rest of the series. Once again, by not giving all of the answers, it created more places for my imagination to run wild. When Rilian, I hope it's Rilian in The Silver Chair, when the prince is given the opportunity to go further into Underworld, into like the bottom of the earth, and that hole closes and he's not able to go, that gave me a whole other excuse to say, what if there was an option to go somewhere where no one else has ever been? What would the temptation to do that be like? What would it be like in Underworld? And then after The Silver Chair, I did something that became pretty typical for me growing up, which was I didn't want to be done with Narnia. Now, I didn't know what happened in the last battle, but I didn't want this series to end. I always wanted to imagine that there was some way for me to get to Narnia somehow. They do it in multiple different ways in the book, and I always had that hope that I could go to Narnia. So my disappointment was very strong when I was a little bit older, and I read The Last Battle, and Narnia is destroyed and the world ends. Not only was that the end of Narnia, the series, it was the end of a certain developmental level moment for me in my childhood, because this thing that had created an interest in fantasy, it had caused me to grow so much in my creativity and my imagination and the way that I created my own stories in my head for my brother and I and my sister to play with. It had finally come to an end because Narnia, like I said, was destroyed in the last battle. You could see spiritual allusions in the last battle very strongly to the end of the world, Armageddon, the Antichrist, and the book ends with everyone dying and essentially ending up in heaven, which I know is technically a happy ending, but my sadness for seeing Narnia go, because you do see Narnia itself gets conquered before the end of the world. You see Narnia fall to the bad guys, and then the characters all die, ended a part of my childhood with it. I know the books were written a long time before I was even born, but it was a significant part in my development, I think, reading The Last Battle for the first time. Frankly, if I'm honest, it's still a rough read for me. I just finished it again, and it's just hard for me to see Narnia go. Of all of the books that I've ever read, I have experienced the Chronicles of Narnia in its various adaptations and forms more than anything else. I've read the books at least 8 times each, probably more for specific ones that were my favorites. I've listened to the audio dramas numerous times. I've seen all of the film adaptations except for the newest Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I started watching it and I just hated it. I thought it was trash. I'm sorry if you like it. But this series is a part of me and was hugely instrumental in me developing a taste for fiction and fantasy in a way that's completely unmatched. As a child, I got some of the religious symbolism going on, but as an adult, I see a lot more of it. Though, I think that if you look online, you can find people that are just going all the way with trying to, I think, overanalyze every single aspect of Lewis's work as if it were an allegory. There's some crazy things going on if you try hard enough. But honestly, I don't think that's what was intended for. I do think Lewis was trying to have some spiritual lessons, some Christian tenets in his book. But I do think so much of the books were just created as fairy tales for fairy tales' sakes that it's not something that was meant to just be critically analyzed out the butt. I do think this was a series created for children to help them enjoy childish, and I don't use that term pejoratively, fantasies in a safe and fun way. Your characters are honorable, your good guys are good, your bad guys are bad. It's very simple and binary. And there was something fun and valuable about that for me growing up. It has been easily over a decade since I read these books until recently, so I'm so thankful for Faye from Mystery Date with a Book for doing her Narnia read-along, for giving me another excuse to jump back into these books and re-experience them. Of course, as an adult, it's kind of crazy to see just how short these books were, because as a child, it took me a lot longer to read them, especially because I was spacing them out. And so being able to just read them almost entirely in a sitting or two was different. It did make them feel a little bit less epic, especially when I just read The Way of Kings. That's a 1,000-page book. This is not very developed. But I don't think it was intended to be the same thing. I think it was intended to be a fairy tale, as C.S. Lewis stated it. What are your guys' experiences with the Chronicles of Narnia? Have you read them? Have you only read one of them? A lot of people have only read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, like they had to read it in school or something, and they never read the other books. Have you read the other books? Which ones are your favorite? Did anything I say about this series interest you? When I talked about this before on some other videos, there were a lot of people who had read these books that were not religious in any way, and they were able to enjoy them as fairy tales also. I think that's really cool. For those people who read these books as kids who were Christians, how much of the Christian symbolism did you get when you were growing up? Do you think you got it all? Do you think you only got a little? I think the stuff with Aslan being Jesus or God or having those parallels or whatever are extremely obvious, and so I think it's really easy to see some of that stuff. But I think that if you dig deeper as an adult, there's more deeper, cooler illusions there, like the whole Eustace as a dragon in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader being a picture of redemption and the nature by which he has to shed his dragon skin. I think that stuff is really powerful as an adult. Completely missed it as a child, just did not understand it at all. I knew it involved Aslan. I didn't really click with understanding the metaphor, even though as an adult it seems so obvious. Heck, reading The Last Battle with the whole Antichrist scene, that was completely missed on me. All of the parallels between the different factions that happen in The Last Battle, that all makes a lot more sense to me as an adult. I see that a lot stronger now than I ever did as a kid. As a kid, it was just kind of what was happening. It just happened. I didn't think about it. Anyway, I hope this video was enjoyable for you. I love doing this reread, so once again, thank you to Faye for hosting this read-along. I thought it was cool to be able to watch other people's videos on Narnia as we're doing this read-along. I hope there's a couple more now that we're finishing it. If you like this video or hearing my thoughts talking about books, please remember to subscribe to my channel. You can hit the thumbs up if you like this video. If you didn't like it, leave a thumbs down. Like I said, please comment down below whether you read this series or you like this series or what you got out of this series or whether this series was important to you or not. Did you read all the books? Did you not read all the books? I'm curious because I don't know anybody else's views on the Chronicles of Narnia outside of the circles I had as a kid. Anyway, I hope you're all having an awesome day. See ya!
We sleep all day and rock the night. We just